Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Today we continue our study in Hebrews chapter 11. We're in verses 23 through 26, which reads, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward." That's Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. Today we continue our study of biblical faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Having considered several from the Old Testament, today we turn our attention to Moses, whom God specifically chose to lead the Israelites from captivity in Egypt to salvation in the Promised Land. Moses was also the mediator of the Old Covenant and is commonly referred to as the giver of the law. The unknown writer of this letter wrote to a group of young Hebrew Christians who had come to recognize the Lord Jesus as the long-promised Messiah of the Old Testament. They had left Judaism because it had developed into a system of works which taught that if one were good enough and moral enough and observed all of the ceremonies and all of the rituals and did their part to keep the law externally and do all of the required things that the rabbis had added, they would be accepted by God. And they came to understand it is impossible to earn the favor of God. If it were possible for any of us to measure up to acceptability before Him, He would be a very small God. In verse 23 of today's passage, we read, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command." Moses' life can be described in 3 40s. The first 40 was spent growing up in Egyptian luxury. The second 40, he shepherded another man's sheep on the backside of the wilderness. And the last 40 was spent leading the Israelites out of Egypt. D.L. Moody once said, "Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody." The providence of God is when God uses the events of our lives to miraculously bring about His will in our lives, and I might add, through our lives. Such was the case for Moses. The Jews had become so innumerable in Egypt that Pharaoh issued a decree to have all the Hebrew male newborns thrown into the Nile River. But God spared the life of Moses for obvious reason. The word beautiful indicates God gave Moses outstanding physical features that served him in the various callings God made on his life. This only illustrates where God guides, He will always provide. In verse 24 of today's passage, we read, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter." Moses weighed the wealth of Egypt and the prestige of royalty against the satisfaction of knowing the living God and being His instrument in the lives of His people. He unhesitantly chose because he looked beyond the visible and saw the invisible. He saw God at work, and because of that, Moses became the man more than any other man in recorded history who saw God doing things and learned to know God intimately. Faith in the God of the Bible rejects this world's prestige. Moses, by the providence of God, had been put in a basket covered with pitch and set in the Nile River to float away. His mother did that because there was a decree to kill all the Hebrew babies. And so, in order to save his life, they simply let him float away, cared only by the providence of God. Had he been one of the Hebrew babies to be killed by Pharaoh, there would be no story of Moses, and God's history would never have been what God ordained it to be. As a baby, Moses floated down the river and just so happened to be discovered by the daughter of Pharaoh, who claimed him as her son. Amazingly, for the first 12 years of Moses' life, the most impressionable years of his life, Moses was raised miraculously by his mother. The daughter of Pharaoh needed someone to nurse the baby, and that nursing led to 12 years in the home of his mother and father. With the formal education of Egypt, Moses learned hieroglyphics and hieratic scripts. He no doubt copied the texts that were part of his formal education. And while doing that, he learned the languages of the surrounding nations. All of this was used of the Lord to prepare Moses to write much of the Old Testament. In verse 25 of today's passage, we read, "Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin." The way the writer of Hebrews lays out the life of, or the faith of Moses, shows how his faith acted. Moses made a series of choices. In fact, the word choosing reveals his life was marked by choices related to his faith in the God of the Bible. This word used by the writer of Hebrews, translated choosing, reveals Moses made a judgment. It was not a rash conclusion. He made it after much contemplation, and his choice did not render the easiest path for Moses. You see, our God-given choices are the hinge of our destiny. We make choices, and our choices make us. For 40 years, Moses knew luxury and ease, and then he chose the will of God for his life. And the will of God often includes little luxury and dis-ease while we live on this earth. When we choose God's will, we are enabled to see the temporary nature of this world's pleasures. The will of God for our lives also enables us to see that which is most substantive in this life. Moses chose to suffer, which led him to a biblical family. It was in that context that Moses learned the deeper truths of God. It is in the context of a family that our greatest needs are met. The two essential elements of family, marriage and parenthood, reveal God's character like nothing else in creation. The love between a husband and wife provides a glimpse of Christ's passionate devotion to us as his bride. In the same way, the ups and downs of parenthood offer a compelling picture of God's tenderness and patience toward us as his children. And family does more than reflect God's character. It provides a safe place where children can experience God's love through the parents and learn how to love other people. In verse 26 of today's passage, we read, "Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward." Clearly, Moses is the picture of one who demonstrates that salvation comes not by works or ritual, but by faith in the God of the Bible. Moses was granted personal belief in the living God, and he built upon that personal belief through many trials in his 120 years on this earth. Moses' choices enabled him to see what others could not see. As a result, Moses had vision. Moses endured reproach that was similar to that which Christ endured. Although he didn't know about Christ and he didn't know Christ, he just knew that there was the promise of the coming deliverer. But we know, and the readers of Hebrews know, that he was willing to take a reproach to move from having everything to basically having nothing. From being honored to being treated with scorn and disdain, as was Christ. Like the Lord Jesus, Moses was rich, but he chose to become poor for the sake of others. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, don't hesitate to shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.